the trade between the two countries is still increasing, even today.
On the back of this crisis, when everyone's talking about the possible recession in the European economy, you hear people talk more and more about the fact that Russia needs to turn towards the east at this point. So if that was to happen, if Russia were to turn itself towards China, how would that change the very face of the Russian-Chinese relationship if we were to forge that economic tie?
China actually has been the engine of world economy at least for 30 years. So I think your policy toward Asia Pacific region, especially toward China, is a good choice. In economic cooperation in trade. Actually, I think the two countries, though we are neighbors, not so good. In economy, our trade with Japan, with ASEAN nations, increased very fast. But I think Sino-Russian economic relations are not as good as the relations, the trade, with Japan, with ASEAN nations. So we have much room to do more cooperation in this regard, in economy and trade.
Moving on now, the war rhetoric from Washington towards Iran is again being ramped up just ahead of the second round of high-level international talks on the country's nuclear program. U.S. military top brass claim they would need just 3 weeks to defeat Iran's armed forces. Artis Genech looks at whether it's just more tough talk or preparation for real action.
The Pentagon says they're just doing some contingency planning in case Iran attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz or attacks U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf. But analysts say it's the kind of planning that drives the tensions to a whole new level. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that Iran is encircled militarily. Here is Iran, and here are the countries in red where the U.S. has military presence. We tried to put on the map those U.S. bases which have been reported about. They are in flashing blue here. Here you have the friendly Arab countries. Right next to Qatar, it's Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Fifth Fleet. That's 40 ships, 16,000 personnel, 2 huge aircraft carriers. Kuwait, which right after the drawdown in Iraq, the U.S. there has increased the size of standby combat force. America's Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marines are boldly positioned in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. That's to the south of Iran, in Turkey and Israel to the west, and Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east. Most recently, the U.S. Air Force has dispatched a number of F-22 Raptor strike fighters to a base in the United Arab Emirates. And here it is, the brand new penetrating strike fighter. The move has caused backlash from Tehran. In addition to the hardware, the U.S. Central Command says there are about 125,000 U.S. troops in close proximity to Iran, not to mention new drone bases at undisclosed locations also in the region. U.S. officials say an enhanced presence in the Gulf is meant to serve as a, quote, quick reaction contingency force, not simply as a prelude to war. But the buildup seems to exacerbate the hostile talk, which may at one point turn into an all-out confrontation. The Iranian military is, of course, no match to the American military might. After all, we're talking about the country that spends on its military more than the next 10 top defense spending countries combined. So crushing Iran is in America's power, but most analysts agree. What's also in its power is producing the kind of instability in the region that would be far worse than what came out of Iraq and Afghanistan.
The European Union has imposed tough new sanctions on Iran in a fresh effort to exert pressure over its nuclear program. But Britain, France and Germany have also stressed that they're willing to negotiate if Tehran immediately suspends its atomic activities and respects its international obligations. The EU's Foreign Affairs chief also suggested the door remains open for talks to resolve the situation.
I want to stress, however, that sanctions are not an end in themselves. I've often talked about this being part of a twin-track approach, that the purpose of sanctions is to put pressure on Iran to come back to the negotiating table.
Iran has described the move as psychological warfare and warned it will worsen the standoff over the Islamic State's nuclear program. One minister even threatened the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But American, French and British warships have all passed through today without any incident.
Iran has been ready for cooperation with the IAEA to remove the ambiguities. During our time, you remember, in 2003 to 2005, we implemented additional protocol. We implemented subsidiary arrangement code 3.1. We even suspended the enrichment. We gave access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. We opened the military sites to the IAEA. But the EU3 was not able to recognize the legitimate rights of Iran because the US position was zero enrichment. That's why negotiations during our time failed, despite the fact we were ready for full transparency, and we proved practically. During President Ahmadinejad, Russia in 2011 proposed a step-by-step plan. The Russian step-by-step plan consisted of all major requirements of the IAEA, Atomic Energy Agency, and United Nations Security Council resolutions, and even beyond. But Iranian officials, they welcomed the Russian initiative as a base for negotiations. It was the US and the Europe which declined the Russian proposal. Therefore, I believe, again, even today, the Russian proposal can be a good base for negotiations.
You personally worked with IAEA monitors in Iran for several years, and while the international observers are known to have accused Iran of not letting them see everything they want, while Tehran has been saying that it can't satisfy all of their demands. Who is right?
It depends. Iran is a member of Safeguard. They are asking Iran to implement additional protocol. Implementing additional protocol is not mandatory for the nations, for the countries. Today, 70 countries, they do not implement additional protocol. Therefore, this would be a gesture, a goodwill from Iran to implement additional protocol. The IAEA is even requesting Iran to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. No nation in this world has given access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol. I believe Iran is ready. If they recognize the rights of Iran for enrichment like any other member of NPT, and if they are prepared ultimately to lift the sanctions, to start lifting the sanctions gradually, at the end state to lift all sanctions. If the West and the P5+1 are ready on these two issues, I believe Iran would show goodwill to accept additional protocol, to cooperate with the IAEA on possible military dimension issues, which would need to give access to the IAEA beyond additional protocol.
Buildup is in the works. Thousands of U.S. troops now gearing up to go to Israel. The military is calling it an exercise, not a deployment. But this is one serious exercise. This, as Israel says, they're ready to go to war with Iran. So what's really going on here? Jamal Abdi is in studio to dig deeper into this. Welcome, Jamal. So the U.S. is tightening ties with Israel. What is happening?
Well, what is happening on its face is that the U.S. is working to reassure Israel, to reassure Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that we have their backs, that we have this security blanket in the region, and that they don't have to worry about Iran as a threat. But as we can see, we're getting closer and closer to war with Iran. Anybody who argues that this, kind of extraordinary confluence of events, the planned exercises by the U.S. and Israel, the exercises that Iran was doing in the Persian Gulf, anybody that argues that those aren't sort of part of a lead up to eventual military confrontation, I think is probably running out of arguments at this point. And the reason that this is happening is that this is the logical conclusion of our current strategy against Iran. We have sanctions in place with no diplomacy. The only way that that ends is through confrontation.
They are calling this particular buildup a deployment, an exercise, and not a deployment. But is there more to it?
Well, this is something that has been planned for quite a while now. It's not the first time that this sort of exercise has been done with Israel. But what is being planned is actually, back in September, the U.S. actually provided Israel with an advanced radar, and for the first time actually permanently deployed U.S. troops to Israel. That was a small contingent, though, of a couple hundred troops. What we see now, though, is this much larger exercise, not unprecedented, but definitely something that is going to have an impact right now as we see this sort of tit-for-tat in confrontation between the U.S. and Iran.
So we are seeing a lot in that region, as you just mentioned, this permanent presence, and now this massive military exercise.
Yeah, and this is to set up, this is for a contingency plan, but I would argue that this is a contingency plan that we're going to see enacted if we don't find a way to change course. The idea is that were there to be a massive war in the Middle East, presumably with Iran, that we would be ready to have set up command within Israel and actually have Israel set up a command center in Europe at the U.S. European Command.
And Israel at this point seems both ready and willing to go to war with Iran. So if they do, will the U.S. automatically join them?
Well, that's the funny thing. Some have said that the Obama administration believes that it could distance itself from an Israeli strike on Iran. And there have been these sort of public leaks in which U.S. officials have said Israel wouldn't notify us until jets were scrambled and in the air before they struck Iran. But that being said, given that we're doing this massive military exercise, given that the U.S. has actually, under Obama in 2009, actually provided Israel with these bunker busters that presumably would be used against Iranian nuclear facilities, I think it's going to be very difficult to not be implicated, for the U.S. not to be implicated in an Israeli strike on Iran. And so I don't see a scenario in which this happens and we are not forced into some sort of all-out war.
So you're saying the likelihood is if Israel goes, the U.S. will go?
Absolutely. And Iranian officials have said this. They're going to consider any strike by Israel a strike by the United States.
Now, this huge buildup is happening as President Obama just today announced that there's supposed to be this big reduction in military spending. And in order to do that, he's bringing the troops home from Iraq, from Afghanistan. But now we're seeing this possible military conflict with Iran. So is it possible that this isn't really much of a drawdown or a shrinking of military, but just a redirecting of resources?
Well, you'll recall that under Bush, we didn't consider the Iraq or Afghanistan wars as military spending. They were a separate budget item. And I would argue that you can't actually reduce military spending unless we actually have a strategic realignment that puts more of a focus on diplomacy. We can't continue the policies of the Bush administration and of previous administrations when it comes to Iran, policies that can only end in military confrontation. If we don't change those, we're going to end up spending the money that previous administrations would have spent on a war. We're locked into this trajectory.
And one method that the U.S. is using are these sanctions, but some argue that these sanctions are in themselves an act of war.
Well, Iran has said that they would consider sanctions on their oil exports and sanctions on their central bank an act of war. I think it could be reasonably argued that the covert attacks within Iran, and frankly, some of the things that Iran does could all be considered acts of war, and that there is a Cold War going on. There's also an economic war going on against Iran. So I think that we do have a low-scale war right now, and the question is, does that actually escalate out of control into a full-scale war? And I'll say that, what's happening now with Iran, people are calling it desperation. They're saying that what's happening is actually a sign that the sanctions are working. But I think that begs the question, what are the sanctions intended to do? if they're working to bring us closer to war, then absolutely they are working.
This isn't just about nuclear weapons. If it were about nuclear weapons in the Middle East, then the United States would have a bone to pick with Israel, which is the only power in the Middle East which actually possesses nuclear weapons. It's not about that. That's the casus belli. But the reason for this continued conflict is because the American administration simply can't live with an Iran which has as much regional power as it has at the moment.